cases. So I'll quickly move on to paralytic strabismus, basic workup of paralytic strabismus, and then we'll take nystagmus, and then if there is any time left, we will discuss some of the management of difficult cases. So yes, so I'll be talking about incompetent strabismus. All that we have talked about actually comes up in this broad chart that we can see. Strabismus can be pseudo, latent, which is occasionally there, and of course manifest to latent intermittent squints and latent esotropy, as we've talked about. Manifest squints can be comitant. We've discussed the common eso and exotropes. We discussed the incomitant strabismus that can be paralytic and restrictive and very rarely strabismic, spastic. Paralytic strabismus is basically due to underaction of a muscle, which could be neurogenic or myogenic in origin, and restrictive is because of inability of the eye to move in a particular direction because opposing forces or something that is stopping the eye from moving in that direction. Clinical characteristics for both would be incompetence or limitation of movement. So they called incompetent because the eyes do not move together. Competent moves together. They are commies and both eyes move together in a direction. Incompetent, the eyes don't move together in a direction. So in one direction, there will be minimal or no strabismus. And as the eyes move in the other direction, the deviation starts increasing. They manifest with diplopia. And like you can see in this case, in a third nerve, you can see the limitation of movement very clearly there. In this case of a left sixth nerve, you can see abduction deficits. It's important in any patient of incompetent strabismus to do a detailed systemic workup. And if it's acquired paralytic, you need to do a complete workup for possible etiology. Besides ocular examination and fundus examination, visual fields are essential in case you suspect there is a space occupying lesion, because sixth nerve palsies could be a sign or a false localizing sign of a raised intracranial pressure due to any cause, including IIH or tumors, which are essential to be picked up in the very time you see the child. Head postures are very commonly seen in incompetence strabismus because the patient may try to motor correct for the diplopia that he or she may have, and very rarely they may actually do have a head posture to increase the deviation so that the disturbing image falls in the far periphery and becomes easier to ignore. It's always important to look for ocular motility and saccadic velocities. You need to do both versions and duction. So in this case, you could see this child was actually cross-fixating and not abducting because he was fixing with the other eye in the opposite gazes. But the moment you do adduction, you realize that there is no limitation of movement and it is just because of a cross-fixating eye. The other important thing you look for is aberrant innervation or aberrant regeneration. It is commonly seen in congenital cases, in traumatic cases, and tumors. So it's important to remember that if you see aberrant innervation or aberrant regeneration in an acquired non-traumatic case, always rule out tumors. It's tumors unless proved otherwise. So it's important, like in this case, you can see it also helps us in decision making and managing. So this was a case you can see that besides when the eye adopts, you can see the lid retraction. So there are misfired fibers from the medial rectus going to the LPS, causing the aberrant innervation. You need to measure deviation in primary and secondary because unlike a comitant squint, primary deviation and secondary deviations are different, with secondary deviations being more because secondary deviations are those which are deviations when the paratic or the abnormal eye fixates, and primary deviations are when the normal eye fixates. So when you force fix the paratic eye, the fixing eye of the normal eye would have a greater innervation, and therefore the normal eye will show a much larger deviation. So secondary deviations will always be more than primary deviations in a comitant squint. So if you even think it's a comitant squint and you have a difference of either eye fixing, so always in every squint, measure the deviation with either eye squinting. You may be able to pick up a partially resolved paratic squint, which you think is actually a comitant squint or a late onset presentation of a comitant squint. Diplopia charting and pattern of the diplopia helps us to understand the way or the cause of the strabismus or the deviation. And you need to do, of course, do first whether it's a diplopia is uniocular or binocular, you need to fix the area of single binocular vision. You see where the distance between the images is maximum. And very important, use a slit source for measuring diplopia, because you need to identify whether the images are inclined or straight. The moment the images are inclined or the patient complains of even slight inclined or torsional diplopia, you're considering cyclovertical muscles as the cause. So this is the way a patient of sixth nerve will present with diplopia maximum in the direction where the muscle is underacting. Hess or Lee charts can be used to demonstrate the deviation. It helps in understanding strabismus, paralytic strabismus, which is not easy to understand, and also in follow-up. So this is the way a sixth nerve palsy. So this is a right sixth nerve palsy. You can see the smaller squares is where the paresis is, and a corresponding overaction or a secondary deviations that can be seen in the left eye. Similarly, you can see a left superior oblique underaction here. So the left superior oblique is underacting. Correspondingly, the right inferior rectus is showing an overaction. When the left eye is fixed, the right eye will show a corresponding overaction. Restriction versus paresis, it's important that the restriction of movement should be picked, whether there is any true restriction or it's a paresis. For that, you need to do a forced duction test. And the forced duction test is possible under topical anesthesia in older children or general anesthesia in younger children. So you hold the limbus at the opposite end, ask the patient to look in that direction, and then lift the eye for recti, press the eye for obliques, and you rotate it in that direction. Like in this case, the eye can be moved or rotated laterally, which was not possible when the patient was voluntarily asked to move. So in this forced duction, you can see it is free and there is no restriction of the medial rectus, and there is a paresis of the lateral rectus. Now you need to do an active force generation test in case the force duction test is tight. If the FDT is free, there is no need to actually do really an active force generation test, because if the muscle was actually active, the eye would have rolled spontaneously and normally during voluntary movement. But if the medial rectus is tight and you do not know how much force there is in the lateral rectus, you need to ask you hold the limbus, then you ask the patient to look into the direction of the muscle, which was paretic, and then you feel for the tug. If you can feel a tug, there is an active force in that eye, and your surgery planning accordingly gets modified. You measure torsional changes by subjective or objective means. You do a double Maddox rod, synaptophore, and scotometry in subjective, and you can just do an indirect or a fundus photograph to see for true torsional changes. So here you can see the torsional change. This is the line at which between the lower third the fovea should be, and you can clearly see bilaterally the fovea is much lower than the normal range. So you can pick up torsion by fundus photographs and see for change. Rule out neuroimaging is required in an early paretic squint or a paretic squint which is young, pupillary involvement in a third nerve, aberrant regeneration without trauma, non-resolving or progressive, or if other neurological cases or things are involved. So we'll stop here for incompetence.